There used to be a myth that samurai themselves wouldn't handle firearms because it was kind of beneath them. You know, they were people of the bow and of the sword, Nobunaga himself not being too bothered by the bloodshed. They seem to have turned the design up to 11. Heavily armed female shinobi is a little bit of a stretch for this period. Welcome to Echoes of History. I'm Dr. Chris Harding. I'm a cultural historian of Japan at the University of Edinburgh. Today we're going to take a look at Assassin's Creed Shadows, and in particular the figure of Oda Nobunaga, a famous and famously bloodthirsty part of the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period. I haven't played this game before, so I'm looking forward to finding out what they've done. Do be aware that there will be spoilers coming up. If you like what you see, we have plenty more on the Echoes of History channel, and if you like what you see, please also like and subscribe. So we can see everybody starting to bow down as Oda Nobunaga comes in on his horse. I think he looks the part. It's difficult with Oda Nobunaga because we don't have any portraits of him that were done actually during his lifetime. We have one that was done a little way afterwards, and which may have been done in a kind of stylized way rather than true to who he really was. But we do have a description of him from one of the Jesuits, Louis Frois, who's here. And he remembered Nobunaga as being tall and thin with a sparse beard. So which isn't terribly much to work with in knowing what he might have looked like. But I think how they've got him here looks not out of place. And it's wonderful to see everybody around him paying the kind of groveling respect that they would have done in this period. All that looks fairly good to me, actually. And then we have Yasuke appearing here. We'll talk a little bit more about him in a moment. And then coming in for an audience with Oda Nobunaga, we've got these tatami mat floors. The arrangement of the tatami looks slightly strange compared with what we might expect for this period. But having Nobunaga here slightly raised and then his guests crouching before him in this way, I think that's all perfectly as we'd expect.
Lord Nobunaga, I present to you Father Valignano. Father Valignano has come to request free movement for his priests in your lands.
That is correct, Sir Ranmaru.
And then you have the Jesuits, Louis Frois and Alessandro Valignano in front of him here.
Lord Nobunaga, he does not understand us.
I would have many questions for this man, if only he understood. He is all the people of Kyoto speak about since his arrival.
It's interesting to see Nobunaga here saying, if I could talk to Yasuke, he could tell me so many things. I think that's quite true to who Nobunaga was. We know that he grilled Louis Frois, I think for about 3 hours, something like this, asking him about India, asking him about the wider world. So Nobunaga really is an individual, I think, with great curiosity about the outside world, and we really see that playing out here. We also get the impression that he's someone that you wouldn't want to cross. And I think, again, this is true. We're seeing Nobunaga here towards the end of his career, already a hugely successful warlord. In terms of his personality, from Japanese sources and also from Jesuit sources, we have a sense of someone who didn't suffer fools gladly, a strategic genius, but that meant that he didn't really listen to advisors very much. He had, I think Louis Frois says that he despised other feudal lords. He really didn't take them all that seriously. He despised or disbelieved in the gods, didn't believe in immortality, didn't have time for long speeches, wanted people to get to the point. I think a deeply pragmatic man, but certainly someone that you would fear. By this point, anyone who knows Nobunaga knows that he is not afraid of getting his hands dirty and bloody. He has the lives of thousands, tens of thousands of people on his hands, Buddhists, other warriors, men, women, children. So I think however friendly he might be to you, if you're in Yasuke's shoes, if you're smart, you'll be very, very cautious about how you treat this man.
I had thought to kill you all. If the Christians were gone, it would be one less thing to consider.
Suggesting to Yasuke that he was thinking he might have the Jesuits killed, but actually they're quite useful for their links with Portuguese traders. Which again, I think is actually quite true to the real historical context here. The Portuguese and Spanish missionaries, the Jesuits, were welcomed by some Japanese, particularly in the south of Japan on the island of Kyushu, where they did most of their missionizing. So some people really welcomed the gospel. They found the Jesuits, philosophically interesting. But I think for the most part, the Jesuits were of interest because they had these really good relationships with Portuguese traders. And the Portuguese were trading between Japan, China, India, and Europe. And they were bringing in enormous amounts of money into Japan. That trade was worth a huge amount. So someone like Nobunaga is, I think, quite conscious of that and is willing to give the Jesuits a bit of leeway, partly because of that.
Your servant, Diogo, stays. He may yet prove useful to me.
Ah, very well. Though he is good for little more than bearing your sandals.
Under me, sandal bearers become lords.
And then this lovely comment at the end here, that even though you start out as a sandal bearer, talking to Yasuke, you can do something great. He's talking, of course, about one of his generals, Hideyoshi, who started out exactly that way and was one of Nobunaga's most trusted men by this point. So it's lovely to see Azuchi Castle brought to life here. Sadly, we don't actually know what Azuchi Castle looked like. We have a description by the Jesuits, which says it's this amazing place, this huge castle with sloping stone foundations, with possibly a 7-story high main keep or donjon, done in dazzling white with gold on the top, and extraordinarily beautiful inside. Sadly, it was burned down in 1582, and there were painted screens made showing exactly what Azuchi was like. These were actually given to the Jesuits. Then they ended up in the Vatican collection, and then they got lost. We're seeing him here bathing. It's interesting. One of the things that the Japanese initially thought about the Jesuits and the Portuguese was that they stank. They thought it was funny, actually, I think, that the Jesuits were preaching this ultimate God, this ultimate deity, and yet they had bad personal hygiene. So it kind of counted against the Jesuits, I think, that they didn't bathe more often. I think this is quite true to the sense that in Japanese culture, bathing was important. Louis Freus tells us that a lot of samurai would bathe almost every day, as Nobunaga is doing here. So I think that's fairly true to the reality. I think it was actually Valignano, who they're talking about here, who commanded his Jesuits to behave better, to bathe, to dress more carefully, to eat with chopsticks, all these things that he thought might raise the Jesuits' profile a bit with the Japanese.
You know the ways of these Jesuits intimately.
True. I have spent more time among them than I would have chosen.
This is interesting. What strikes me as a little bit unusual is the idea that Oda Nobunaga would see Yasuke as a fellow outsider, and that they could almost be on the same side and discuss the Jesuits, for better or for worse, together. I'm not sure that Nobunaga would have confided in Yasuke or perhaps trusted his opinion in quite this way, but at least to a nice, interesting conversation, gets us into what did the Japanese really feel about the Jesuits.
Who are these people, really? Speak openly. Do they serve themselves or their God?
I think this is maybe a bit one-sided on the Jesuits. What we're getting here is the idea that they were kind of religious empire builders and that it was a bloody and self-interested process. Certainly the Jesuits had a bad reputation, particularly in places like Latin America, the way that they treated some local peoples there. There's no getting away from that. I think in Japan, though, the Japanese had a more nuanced view of them. So some in Japan saw them as people who were helping to bring trade, helping to bring money as a result. Others, there were feudal lords in Kyushu, in southern Japan, who actually converted to Christianity, took on Portuguese names, and ended up actually quite close to the Jesuits. Famously, the Jesuits were given Nagasaki on the island of Kyushu and developed it into this amazing and money-making port. So I think there are two sides to the way that the Japanese viewed the Jesuits, and this seems to perhaps give us a slightly negative and maybe a slightly more modern view on the Jesuits, which is criticizing their mission and criticizing the way that they went about it.
Ieyasu, let us see how my newest samurai handles a teppo.
So I really like this scene. They're packing in a huge amount of history here. There used to be a myth that samurai themselves wouldn't handle firearms because it was kind of beneath them. You know, they were people of the bow and of the sword. But we know actually that's not true. People like Oda Nobunaga himself would train on these firearms. And here we've got Tokugawa Ieyasu, one of his great successors, doing exactly the same.
The Portuguese call it an akibas.
Yes, and we learned from them. See the smooth barrel and handcrafted trigger. Made by craftsmen in Nagahama.
An impressive copy.
More than a copy. We have improved it.
These firearms were brought in by the Portuguese, 1540s, 1550s, and they weren't just copied by Japanese gunsmiths, they were improved on, and we think by the end of the 16th century, tens of thousands were being produced every single year in Japan. Hugely important to the conduct of war in this period. And Oda Nobunaga was probably one of the greatest warlords to really employ them to great effect.
With 1,000 such weapons at Nagashino, my Ashigaru broke the Takeda cavalry charge. A great victory that also left me empty. Enemies or not, those noble warriors were cut down like harvest wheat, volley after volley, as the men and horses screamed in the rain.
He mentions here the Battle of Nagashino in 1575. This is sometimes remembered as the first great gunpowder battle in Japan, where he had 3 ranks of arquebusiers firing one after the other to give the other 2 ranks time to reload. Whether or not he did that, Nagashino, I think, is an important battle for the use of these weapons. But at the same time, what's lovely here is they also mentioned the rain at that battle. Because one of the reasons I think Nobunaga won, was successful, him and Tokugawa Ieyasu together, was that the enemy cavalry got a bit bogged down in the rain. It failed to encircle Nobunaga and his allies. And that's another one of the reasons why the Battle of Nagashino went Nobunaga's way. Nobunaga, as I said earlier on, has a lot of blood on his hands. He's famously someone who would, of course, be ruthless in battle, but he would also not often distinguish between men, women, and children in combat. So when he took some of his soldiers up Mount Hiei, which is the stronghold of the Tendai Buddhist sect just outside Kyoto, they killed everybody, thousands and thousands of people, including children. Then when he would take hostages from some of his enemies, their wives and their children, just as a kind of guarantee of good behavior, if the men then went against Nobunaga, he would have the women and the children led out. He'd have them crucified or burned at the stake or beheaded. Even chronicles written in Japanese, written one in particular I'm thinking of, written by a retainer of Nobunaga. So almost a hagiography, but certainly quite partisan in Nobunaga's favor. Even that chronicle has lots of instances where Nobunaga is prepared to do that, where he doesn't shy away from spilling very, very large amounts of blood and what we would consider innocent blood at the same time. So I'm not quite sure that this, oh dear, they were mown down like harvest wheat. I doubt he lost much sleep over that.
There is still the Iga problem.
I would have let those hill peasants alone if my idiot son had not felt the need to prove himself.
So we're seeing Oda Nobunaga here going into a council with his senior generals. From what we know of Nobunaga, this would have been a difficult moment for his generals because Nobunaga was and regarded himself as a great strategist. He wasn't given to taking advice much of the time. And what I think they get right here, which I really like, is a sense of competition between different generals.
We have serious affairs to address.
We do.
But can we talk matters of strategy and war before this foreigner?
We've got Hideyoshi, already by this point a trusted general. He's done very well for Nobunaga. We've got one of Nobunaga's 11 sons, Nobukatsu. And it's funny here because they're referring to a campaign in Iga province in 1579 by Nobukatsu, which didn't go terribly well. And it's sweet, this idea that a son fails his father and the father has to go in, as he's shortly got to do, and do the job properly himself. And you can see Tokugawa Ieyasu pointing that out in no uncertain terms here.
A traitor who has been a thorn in my side for years.
We starved them out. In exchange for his followers' lives, he gave up his own. Harima is yours, Lord Nobunaga.
It shows you at this point he's dealt with almost all his enemies. We have Iga province here as one of the few last remaining areas of central Japan, which Oda Nobunaga is seeking to bring under his control. And yes, his son having failed to bring home the goods, Nobunaga is going to do it himself.
Yasuke, what is your counsel on this Iga problem?
Lord Ieyasu is wise to practice patience. Let us try to understand our enemy's moves before we act.
One of the things in here which I think surprised me a little bit would be almost his deference to Yasuke. This idea that Yasuke as an outsider can bring some particular element of wisdom. I'm not really sure, we don't really know whether he regarded Yasuke like that. I think critics would say Yasuke was probably not much more than a sword carrier for Nobunaga. He didn't have samurai status in a meaningful way, although that status was quite fluid in this period. But the idea that he might be a trusted advisor is difficult to square with the sources, but then again, the sources don't tell us for sure at all. So the idea that you can have a figure here generated in this imaginative way, someone who might be the wise outsider, I think is an interesting way of doing things. Here we see Yasuke saying that actually we should hold back and be cautious and be pragmatic. That's a set of characteristics, I think, more associated actually with Tokugawa Ieyasu than with Oda Nobunaga. But it's interesting to see him giving that advice here and arguing with these various generals, including Akechi Mitsuhide, about whom we'll be chatting a little bit later on.
I did not expect you to heed my words.
Your words have the power to move armies, Yasuke.
This is probably quite realistic. If he had been listened to by Oda Nobunaga in this way, then he probably would react like this. He'd be saying, I didn't really think that you would listen to me, that you would take me that seriously. And you've got a lovely relationship starting to build up between the two men here. This is really extraordinary. I think the game makers have enjoyed themselves a little bit here. They've maybe taken a few liberties with the armor of the period. In Yasuke's armor here, we're seeing, I think, two different periods of Japanese armor actually coming together. So there's an earlier period, the Kamakura period, a few centuries before this time, when the armor was a bit more ornate, a bit more boxy. In the Sengoku period, armor was simpler. People needed to be able to move around. There was much more combat, not quite so ornate. Although the helmets of the Sengoku period could now and again feature different sorts of motifs. So perhaps Yasuke might have had something like this if he had any armor at all. We don't know for sure that he was given any armor or that he had any warrior role at all for Nobunaga. Even if he was given armor, what is striking me here though as I watch this is not only is it a mixture of Kamakura and Sengoku era armor, even then it's incredibly ornate. They seem to have turned the design up to 11 here, and that his horse would be decked out like that as well is extraordinary. I think it's very unlikely that he would have been given something like this, that many horses at all would have been decked out quite like this. We do know that armor in the Sengoku period, although it was simpler, it was robust, and a lot of effort was put into making sure that it would be bulletproof. I think that's an element of the design I would have liked to have seen here. Some samurai insisted that the armor they were given, especially the front part, would have a dent in it because it had been tested, and you knew that it could stop a bullet, given the importance of firearms in this period. So something like that, a little detail like that would have been lovely. And then this final little bit here, It's wonderful, but the immediate impression you get is, if you didn't know who was who in this scene, you would think that Yasuke was the warlord, was the top person, the most senior samurai in this little gathering, because he's in the center, his horse is higher, his armor is far more ornate, it looks more expensive, the kind of power that he seems to be projecting via that armor, via that horse, is such that in real life, I don't think Oda Nobunaga would have put up with it. Given how sensitive he was about his own position, and given the relatively low esteem in which he held most other people around him, to have been prepared to play second fiddle to Yasuke in terms of who's got the best armor, I think is a bit unlikely, but it does look beautiful.
Can you feel the breeze, Yasuke? It fans the total destruction of Iga. A most perfect night.
Oda Nobunaga and Yasuke here surveying the aftermath of this great battle in Iga province. As we were saying a moment ago, this is Nobunaga's attempt to kind of clear up after his son Katsuyori. It's funny to see him discuss him as his idiot son here. I suppose a man like Nobunaga, by this age, is starting to wonder who it is that will take over from him, hoping he can pass it on in his own family.
What is it?
I've never fought a battle like this. So many lives.
Ever the righteous man.
It's lovely. You've got Yasuke and Nobunaga here having a kind of philosophical discussion where it's a chance to, it feels to me anyway, it's a chance to get to know Nobunaga a little bit more. So we have Yasuke saying, you know, well, I've got all these lives taken, and Nobunaga slightly sarcastically saying, ever the righteous man. Clearly, Nobunaga himself not being too bothered by the bloodshed, which I think is true to what we know of Nobunaga.
Iga's rebellion stands in the way of harmony. I ride with you.
Go. Find Momochi Sandayu. His death will sever the sword from the hand of Iga.
So we're seeing some of the action here with Yasuke. From what he's doing here, these look like traditional, they're called kenjutsu stances with his sword fighting. These look quite good, actually. They look quite authentically done. I don't know that someone, especially wearing that much armor, would have acted with quite so much power or be capable of these enormous Spartan kicks like that. Or at one point, holding someone up on the end of his sword. So maybe a little bit of artistic license here. But certainly his weapons, his stances, the way he's fighting, all look fairly real. I suppose someone might ask whether someone like Yasuke, having been in Japan for not very long, how he, there we go, on the end of the sword, how he manages to acquire skills like this, but it's a game, and I think we can let them get away with that. Here we have a shinobi. So people would nowadays, I think, know them as ninjas. The word comes from the Japanese shinobu, meaning something like stealthy, to be stealthy. So these men, more so than warriors, although the guy here clearly is a warrior, they were involved in espionage, in sabotage, in spying, in kind of guerrilla tactics. This is what they were really known for. And Iga province, which is where we are here, was one of the parts of Japan which was particularly famous for producing these shinobi. So the man here with this kind of ball and chain that he's swinging, that was a weapon at the time in Japan, not used all that often. So I'm not sure how likely it was that someone like this would have been wielding one.
Too much blood spilled has warped your mind. You'll never see the truth.
Oh! Enlighten me, old shinobi.
And waste my breath? Duel me!
Ha ha ha, no. Duels belong in the old world. The old world is dead. This is the way forward.
You'll learn nothing in victory, Oda Nobunaga. In your defeat, you'll know it all.
probably very few people in Nobunaga's life would have been able to speak to him this way, and possibly a scene like this never really happened. But it is a nice chance to, probe a little bit more about Oda Nobunaga, who I think had a view of what he was doing as a kind of destiny. His great motto was rule the realm by force. That was what he planned to do, unite Japan by force. He wasn't beholden to the emperor, to the shogun, who he actually did away with. He wasn't beholden to any gods, whether Shinto or Buddhist. It was entirely a sense of one man being driven by this extraordinary determination. So a chance to sort of get at that here by having a shinobi like this question and chide him just before Yasuke grapples with him. Arch-villain, I suppose, Akechi Mitsuhide here, starting to prepare the tea for the tea ceremony. It looks reasonably authentic here. We don't see much of the preparation. We also don't have a tea master, which you might normally do for this. But I think he's right, as Akechi Mitsuhide says here, that the tea ceremony was quite important to Oda Nobunaga. This is a ceremony that's linked to Zen Buddhism. It's also linked to Japan's, they call it the wabi-sabi aesthetic, which is this simple, withered aesthetic. You can see it in some of the utensils that they're using here. These things were highly prized. There's a line from Alessandro Valignano, one of the Jesuits, saying he couldn't believe the amount that a particular feudal lord had paid for a single tea caddy, because it looked rubbish, it looked badly made. He didn't really understand the aesthetic at all. He said it's the kind of thing back home that you might use as a bird feeder. And yet this feudal lord had paid huge amounts of money for it. So that aesthetic, I think, is really on display here, quite nicely done. And as I say, Oda Nobunaga himself was a big fan. He actually was one of the patrons of probably the most famous tea master in Japanese history, Sen no Rikyu, who also went on to serve Hideyoshi after Nobunaga's death. So it's lovely that they have that detail in here.
He spilled my mother's blood without thought. Yet to spill even one drop of tea, he considers unthinkable.
Akechi here is saying about Nobunaga, he spilled my mother's blood. This is a really interesting myth, that one of the reasons why Akechi Mitsuhide decides to attack Nobunaga is that Nobunaga had held his mother hostage and then had her killed. We're fairly sure this isn't actually true. This is a later invention of a subsequent period in Japanese history. I think by people trying to either explain what Akechi did or perhaps just sort of sex the whole story up a little bit, it seems much more likely that one of the reasons why Akechi did what he did against Nobunaga is that he was sick of being humiliated by him. So Nobunaga, as we were saying a moment ago, doesn't suffer fools gladly. He doesn't take advice well from his generals. He's also the kind of person who will not be afraid of taking people down a peg or two in public. And so we know from a Japanese chronicle of this period that on at least a couple of occasions, Nobunaga was very rude about Akechi Mitsuhide to his face and in front of other generals. So, enormously humiliating. And it looks like probably that would have been one of the reasons why Akechi was determined to do what he did.
If we do nothing, Lord Nobunaga's madness will destroy everything. Our country will fall.
I'm not terribly convinced by the idea that by this point, Akechi Mitsuhide thought that Nobunaga was crazed by the blood that he had shed and that he was turning into a kind of madman, putting the country at risk. I think for most of Nobunaga's generals, what they would have seen is someone who's extraordinarily successful, winning campaign after campaign, starting to actually put Japan back together and doing even little things like having a new taxation system, trying to get the economy going again after decades of chaos. Difficult to make the case, I think, that Nobunaga is about to let the country go to the dogs. Given the enormity of what Akechi Mitsuhide is thinking about doing here and what we know he did in real life, it's certainly important to try and find as many reasons as we can. Just try and find the right ones, I think.
Lord Nobunaga believes himself untouchable. He has sent all his generals away. He remains at Honno-ji, serving tea, unprotected.
The last thing I'm noticing here is that he says that Oda Nobunaga is no longer defended at Honno-ji Temple in Kyoto. Yes. That's not really true. One of the things that Nobunaga really believed in was his own security, always surrounded by his horse guards, his elite security force, basically. These guys terribly close to them. There's one story on a New Year's celebration where Nobunaga and his horse guards would drink Japanese sake from the lacquered skulls of their enemies. So the idea that Nobunaga would have gone anywhere without them, would have gone anywhere without security all around him, I think is just not right.
It is Mitsuhide, Lord Nobunaga.
That impotent traitor! Yasuke, go to the gate. Hold it as long as you can. Run! Take the women and Frois. Set fires on your way out.
Lord Nobunaga, I will not leave you.
Go!
So this is the famous Honno-ji temple. We're in June 1582. Honno-ji Oda Nobunaga was quite often there. So one of the things I always find strange about this is how Akechi Mitsuhide and his men were able to almost sneak up on them. So from what we know from the records, it's reasonably true, I think, to what's happening here is that Nobunaga and his men started to hear things in the distance. Initially, they thought it was maybe a local fight breaking out somewhere else in Kyoto. Then it becomes clear that there are a large number of men hostile to Nobunaga, beginning to attack his men, beginning to attack his positions. And you can sort of hear that going on outside here. I'm not sure, because we don't know, how calm Nobunaga would have been at this point. At least in one of the historical sources, he is absolutely furious. He sort of screams out treason, and then he takes up his bow and arrow and he begins fighting. So we're not seeing that here, a bit of artistic license, I suppose, and also because there's some mythology of the game to get into. In real life, though, we suspect that the traitors were upon him and in that room fairly quickly. And Nobunaga, as I say, first was trying to take them on with bow and arrow. Then he moved to a spear, a pole with a kind of sharpened end on it, very much involved in the fighting, and that he was injured in the course of that fighting. And only then does he go to this side room to perform seppuku, which we'll talk about in a minute. So that bit I'm not so sure about. But what's lovely, after we pass this scene with him being attacked by Naoe, we get this philosophical Nobunaga again, reflecting on the need to shed the blood that he did. A sword has to be forged in fire, these sorts of things.
I have killed many people. I did it to make us strong. One shining sword under heaven with a single destiny. Not for this Shinbakufa. For the country!
You slaughtered innocents!
Such a blade cannot be forged without fire.
So I think there is a poetic, maybe even a romantic element to Nobunaga, which goes against a lot of what we know about him as a bloodthirsty tyrant. There's a story before one battle where Nobunaga, who was a big fan of Japan's No theatre, danced a few steps from a very famous play called Atsumori. And then he started to sing some of the lines, which included the lines, "When we think about man's 50 years in this world, it passes like a dream." So I think there's that element of Nobunaga which maybe goes alongside his interest in the tea ceremony, that he is a cultured individual as well as someone who's prepared to shed extraordinary amounts of blood. So I think this final scene here, where despite what must be an extraordinarily hot and scary environment, he's actually prepared to talk philosophy a little bit with Naoe. There's something to that, I think, which might be true to Nobunaga's character. We can at least speculate, I think. Worth pointing out, I think, that a heavily armed female shinobi is a little bit of a stretch for this period. But again, that's all part of the fun of the game and the gameplay, I suppose. But it's lovely to see him challenged here, as he was by that other shinobi back in Iga province.
I am trapped. I cannot rule after such a failure. You must not get my head. You understand? Please. Yasuke, it is over.
I suppose what's a little bit strange here is that he gives up so quickly. almost seeming to say, even if I'm not forced to take my own life, or if I don't die in the fighting that's upon us, simply because I've suffered this setback, I can't rule anymore. I'm not sure how true that is to the Nobunaga that we know and some of us love and some of us detest. He'd come this far, he'd shed so much blood, he had won so many campaigns, he had such a strong view of himself, kind of as he says here, doing this for the realm. Almost no one else could achieve what he's achieved, bringing order out of chaos. The idea that he gets attacked once by a rebel general and he might think, all right, the game's up, I may as well take my own life. I'm not really sure that Nobunaga would have done that. I think he's probably more the sort to fight to the end. And then we have Oda Nobunaga performing seppuku. This was grisly, as you're seeing here, ritual suicide, where you would disembowel yourself with the short sword, and then you would have someone called your second who would, right at the end, take your head off. We do think this is how Oda Nobunaga died, although probably much more in the heat of battle rather than after a long soliloquy. One of the things we don't know is what happened to his body. We hear him saying to Yasuke here, "Do not let the enemy take my head." We don't know what happened to his body. There were rumors at the time that perhaps he wasn't dead. Perhaps he'd had some kind of miraculous escape and was controlling things from behind the scenes. I think that's fairly unlikely, but there is this element of mystery about precisely what happened in those final moments and what Nobunaga's fate was after he took his own life. I think one of the myths of this period, which it's worth trying to dispel, is that samurai never surrendered. That was simply not true. Plenty of samurai surrendered in the Sengoku period. It's more a myth of a much later era, in peacetime actually in Japan, when they were kind of reinventing the way of the samurai to say that one of the things that was part of a samurai code was that you would never surrender. To be honest, we don't even know as historians how many people in this period who we would regard as being samurai would have even used that word of themselves. They didn't have a code that they lived by. It was quite fluid. And the word samurai, because it comes from the verb to serve in Japanese, it's likely that some of the people in this period would have been quite insulted if you called them a samurai, because there's that element of service being implied, being almost a servant or a slave to somebody else. So we should be quite careful, I think, of the use of the word samurai here. Thank you for joining me as I looked at the depiction of Oda Nobunaga in Assassin's Creed Shadows. If you want to go deeper into the historical events that inspired the game, please click on the links for more interviews on the Echoes of History channel, including with me. Thank you.